I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Windsor West MP Brian Massey introduced a private member's bill in February that, according to him, would protect the choices of Canadian car owners when repairing automotive vehicles. The bill seeks to amend the Competition Act in such a way as to allow vehicle owners the freedom to choose where their vehicles would be repaired for a fair cost. The bill would also ensure vehicles are repaired with the proper tools and parts that manufacturers provide to authorized dealers. The right to repair movement is growing worldwide and is focused on pressuring manufacturers to allow consumers to repair their own devices. Well, with us right now to unpack the right to repair movement is Linus Sebastian, Linus Media Group. Mr. Sebastian, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start with a brief overview of this right to repair movement. What is it all about?
Right to repair is basically the concept that after a consumer purchases a good, whether it's a car or whether it's a cell phone or a screwdriver, it doesn't matter, that it belongs to you and it is your right to do with it as you will, that you shouldn't be bound by any kind of artificial limitation that forces you to go to, say, an authorized dealer or directly to the manufacturer in order to have it serviced or repaired. In a nutshell.
All right. Well, besides the auto industry, are there any other sectors impacted by the right to repair movement?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most prominent ones is farming. That's one that's been grabbing a lot of headlines, particularly in the States, around John Deere and some of the requirements that they have around costly and inconvenient servicing of their tractors and other farm equipment, for example. And anything that increases costs, I mean, it might not be the kind of thing that the general consumer would think affects them, but anything that increases costs for any sector, let's say, for example, agriculture, is going to ultimately affect your costs when you head to the grocery store.
And how might endorsing the right to repair movement impact the environment and environmental concerns?
Oh, I mean, the environmental concerns are frankly one of the largest ones. I think for the average consumer, it's easy to frame it as a cost savings, right? Because everyone's thinking about their wallets, especially with everything going on in the world right now. But the environmental impact is another big one. I mean, for every time you save, let's say, $100 on a costly repair bill, or worse yet, save $1,000 on a device that you don't have to rebuy, right? That's scrap metal or plastics or battery components that are not heading into the landfill or to a recycling center. I mean, there's this misconception that people have that, oh, it'll be recycled, but there's a reason that recycling is the last R. It is the least good R. Reduce, reuse first, and that's a huge part of what right to repair is about. If we can keep these devices in service, then they don't have to make their way to that third R, or even worse, the scrap heap.
An interesting point to consider. Now, what do we know so far about the response from manufacturers when it comes to this movement?
Some manufacturers embrace it. Valve Software famously has entirely embraced right to repair with their new Steam Deck. It's a game console that, while not perfect, has done a lot of things right with respect to making certain components that are likely to wear out quickly, like, for example, the joysticks, very easy, not just for a user to replace by themselves, but also to get access to the components that they would need to perform such a repair. It can be done in about 5 minutes with a screwdriver that anyone should own. Other manufacturers like Apple and Tesla, for example, have actually actively fought against right to repair, whether through software locks in their devices or by designing tools. And coming back around to the automotive industry, which is kind of where we started here, designing tools that are specialized so that only shops that are allowed to repair this device can get access to them or get the training materials that they need to know how to use them. And that's something that just frankly is anti-consumer. It drives up your costs and creates additional waste. Why are we defending this?
All right, Mr. Sebastian, how can our viewers get involved with this process?
We've seen that putting pressure on manufacturers isn't going to change anything. So at the end of the day, what you need to do is you need to reach out to the legislators that govern your particular area, whether it's the country you live in or whether it's your provincial representatives. You need to get in touch. You need to make it clear to them that this is important to you, and you need to explain why. Because at the end of the day, rising costs for consumers are a hugely impactful problem today, and one that needs to be solved And this is a big way that we can all tackle it together.
All right, Mr. Sebastian, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Up next, we discuss Canada's new gun control legislation with Dr. Irvin Waller, an expert on violence prevention. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. The federal government has introduced legislation to control access to firearms, but some gun control advocates are warning that it doesn't go far enough. A national freeze on importing, buying, or selling handguns is a central feature of firearm control legislation tabled today by the federal Liberals. Gun control advocates are praising the earlier assault-style firearm ban, but conservative MPs and others argue that it targets legitimate gun owners and won't prevent illegal firearms from falling into the wrong hands. Well, joining us now to give us his take on this new legislation is Dr. Irvin Waller, emeritus professor at the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa and an expert on violence prevention. Dr. Waller, welcome to Forum Daily.
Good day.
So let's start with this, sir. What is the current state of gun violence and crime in Canada?
So if we look over the last 10 years, there has been an uptick in shootings, and there has also been an uptick in the murders with handguns. We basically returned to a murder rate pretty similar to 10 years ago. So it went down for a little time and then it's been going up. But in the last 5 years, there's a clear trend up. It's not as dramatic as anything in the United States, but it is definitely going up.
Definitely a concerning trend there. Now, we mentioned a freeze on handguns in this new plan. What other legal reforms have been introduced in this legislation, sir?
Well, they have continued the action to deal with assault weapons. So the weapons that were used in Uvalde in the United States and Texas recently were AR-15s, well, one AR-15. And so they're continuing to consolidate that ban. In Canada, we've had relatively few shootings as dramatic as what happens weekly or certainly monthly in the United States and hits headlines, but the Polytechnic event was clearly an example, and the mosque attack in Quebec City was a failed attempt. The assault weapon jammed. So they're continuing to do that, and that I think is important.
And one of the biggest obstacles in gun control in Canada has been the illegal market, illegal smuggling of these weapons through the United States-Canada border. So does this legislation effectively address this issue?
Well, I think we've got to make a big distinction between assault weapons. They have not been smuggled, although the case in Nova Scotia is an exception to that. However, handguns, the police estimate somewhere around 80% of all handguns in Toronto that are used illegally have been smuggled into Canada. And basically all of the use of handguns in urban areas are illegal. These are not committed by people who have a license to own those handguns. Now, this may be different in rural areas, but the vast majority of handgun murders and shootings occur in urban areas.
Just about a minute left here, Doctor, but a lot of experts have pointed out that this is a multi-layered issue. So it's not just the banning of weapons that could fix the issue of gun violence in Canada. There needs to be support for vulnerable demographics most involved in such violence. So how can officials do that, sir? Just about over a minute left.
So this is what is missing from the federal policy. We could reduce the handgun homicides in urban areas by more than 50% in the next few years by using the knowledge we have about how to reach those young men involved in that dangerous lifestyle, These are basically street workers who go out and meet them. They're street workers who meet them when they've been shot in hospital emergency rooms. These are courses in schools that get young men to make better decisions. And I think it's important that this is much more likely to work than a ban when it is so easy to shift. It's been so easy to shift drugs across the border from the United States, and it's going to be just as easy to ship handguns across. If there's a demand for those handguns, they will come across. So let's tackle the demand in a serious way and put serious money in it and be smarter about how we do it.
An important perspective to consider. Dr. Waller, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. When we come back, we'll be examining a new report on sexual misconduct in Canada's military. We'll have an interview with Megan McKenzie, professor of international law and human security at Simon Fraser University, coming up next. Retired Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour has released a scathing report on the Canadian Armed Forces' resistance to change. This despite decades of scandals, criticism, and broken promises. She makes 48 recommendations, saying it's long past time for the military to scrap traditions and structures that perpetuate a sexualized culture. Madame Arbour says some of the military's members are more at risk of harm from their comrades on a day-to-day basis than they are from the enemy, and that this must change. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper understanding of sexual misconduct within the Canadian military is Megan McKenzie, professor of international law and human security at Simon Fraser University, an expert in military culture. Professor McKenzie, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, almost a quarter of women serving in the military have said they'd been sexually assaulted during their careers. So what is fueling this toxic and dangerous culture in the military?
Well, I think it's been decades of a lack of accountability. We have had very low conviction rates when it comes to sexual misconduct and sexual assault. And so you have an environment where perpetrators feel emboldened. They feel like they're going to get away with it. And for many decades, they have, including senior leaders.
And what do we know so far about how this culture impacts male CAF members in the long run, even after leaving the military?
So we know that it affects all members, male and female. We know that half of the victims that came forward in the class action lawsuit were men. This is not an issue that only affects women. So it's a toxic environment for male service members and female service members.
And out of these 48 recommendations in this report, which ones stand out to you as the most impactful?
I think the two that stand out to me, the first one is that she's recommending all criminal sexual misconduct cases be handled in the civilian courts and continue to be handled in the civilian courts. That was an interim recommendation she made about a year ago. And for that to be made permanent is very significant. She's essentially saying the military justice system has not handled these cases properly or well. And that's a major recommendation. The second major one, I think, relates to the military colleges and her call for an extensive review on whether the colleges are useful anymore and the toxic environment of those colleges.
And staying on the point of these military colleges, there are dedicated colleges in Ontario and Quebec, and according to the report, they carry a reputation for perpetuating a sexualized culture. Now, these are officers that are being groomed to enter the military. So what do we know so far about this particular issue in and of itself?
Well, we know that the two military colleges, as the report says, have a history of a sexualized culture. There's a history of service members being assaulted in those colleges. We also know that the colleges are not very representative of Canadian society. Most of the students, the vast majority, are white men from Ontario and Quebec. So one of the recommendations she makes is to consider whether or not service members would be better suited to be integrated into normal, regular universities rather than isolated in a sort of hyper-masculine context.
Now, unfortunately, advocates have been calling for change in the military for years, and there have been similar reports out. So historically, how has the government responded to such calls?
Historically, the government has not responded well. There's been sort of blips of action. lots of commitments, lots of rhetoric, lots of statements like zero tolerance. And then often the majority of recommendations sit on the shelf and gather dust, quite frankly. And so I think what we heard yesterday is the Minister of Defense make a commitment that these recommendations won't sit on the shelf as others have. But I think only time will tell, to be honest.
All right, Professor Mackenzie, about a minute left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on as the government continues to react to this report?
Well, I'm really looking to see, we had a commitment to implementing 17 of the 48 recommendations. Some of those 17 are very sort of low bar, easy recommendations. I'm really looking to see how the review of the military colleges is going to go and what is the commitment on the remainder of those 48 recommendations and what the timeline is going to look like for implementing those recommendations.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Professor Mackenzie, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Don't go anywhere. After the break, we'll be talking about monkeypox as confirmed case numbers begin to rise both in Canada and around the world. We spoke with Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group, about the risks of infection, prevention measures that can be taken against monkeypox, and whether this rare disease possesses the same level of danger as COVID-19 did at the very beginnings of the pandemic. We'll have our weekly medical segment with Dr. Raut coming up after the break, so stay with us. We'll be right back shortly. Toronto Public Health has confirmed a second case of monkeypox and is investigating 6 other cases. Monkeypox is a rare disease that comes from the same family of viruses that causes smallpox, but officials say it doesn't spread easily between people. Earlier this week, the World Health Organization's top monkeypox expert said she was skeptical that the virus would spark a global pandemic. Well, joining us now to give us the latest information on monkeypox in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So how serious of an infection is monkeypox? How does it affect the body both externally and internally?
Well, monkeypox was first discovered in 1958 when we had 2 outbreaks of a pox-like disease in a colony of monkeys kept for research, hence the name monkeypox. The first human case of monkeypox was really around 1970. So it really has been endemic for quite some time. The illness really begins with fever, headaches, muscle aches. You start getting back pains, swollen lymph nodes, chills, and exhaustion. And then about 3 days after all of this, you start developing a rash, often beginning on the face and moving to the different parts of the body. These rashes or lesions tend to become vesicles or pustules, and then eventually scabs, and then fall off there. Typically, it lasts about 2 to 4 weeks, and monkeypox has been shown to cause death in as many as 1 in 10 people who contract the disease.
Sounds like something no one wants, Dr. Raut. Now, it's also said that this condition has a longer incubation period. So how long does it take for symptoms to occur?
That's a good question. So the incubation period, which is the time from infection to symptoms from monkeypox, is actually quite long. We see that it is typically 7 to 14 days, but can range from 5 to 21 days. So almost 3 weeks there.
So how can people prevent spreading the disease if symptoms don't occur for up to 3 weeks?
Right, that is a challenge. Luckily, we've learned a few things from the COVID pandemic here. Most important lesson is to really focus on general prevention strategies, avoiding contact with potentially contaminated surfaces, reducing prolonged face-to-face contact with possibly infected individuals, and of course, good hand hygiene, washing your hands regularly.
All right, Dr. Raut, what do we know about reinfection after getting monkeypox? Is it like chickenpox that you cannot catch it again?
That's a good question. So though uncommon, you can theoretically get chickenpox more than once. The majority of people have had chickenpox, will be immune from it for the remainder of their lives, but there are a few cases there. Having said that, we're going to see something very similar to monkeypox and smallpox. Smallpox also had an infection where survivors had lifelong protection. So barring any significant genetic drift, I think we'll see it very similar with monkeypox, chickenpox, and smallpox, where there's a lifelong protection there.
All right, Dr. Rout. Now, I want to jump to some research I came across today. It indicated that older people who received smallpox vaccinations may have some sort of immunity to monkeypox. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
That's right. So monkeypox comes from the same family as smallpox. And so what we're seeing is smallpox vaccines have been shown to be very effective in preventing monkeypox as well as treating it after exposure. Now, the world eradicated smallpox in 1980. Many countries do keep small stocks of the vaccine in case of emergencies. We know that this vaccine can be up to 85% effective in stopping a monkeypox infection. Canada stopped immunizing people against smallpox in 1972. And we don't know how much smallpox vaccine Canada has available, but what we do know is that Public Services and Procurement Canada has already put out a tender last month to purchase about 500,000 doses of a smallpox vaccine.
All right, and on that note, in terms of the government response, what do you think would be the best steps that officials can take in order to prevent this disease from becoming endemic?
Right. So I think we have to look at the lessons we've learned in previous epidemics and pandemics. Some of us might remember that it was 2003, 2004, where the United States saw 47 cases of monkeypox. During that time, there was really only animal to human transmission from prairie dogs sold as pets, and there were no deaths. But from that pandemic, we learned valuable lessons that we should use today. Number one was contact tracing all potential cases. Second was accurate lab testing of all potential contacts. And third was vaccination and treatment guidelines for at-risk populations right away.
All right, Dr. Rout, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and have a great weekend, everyone. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.